To support this Wild World podcast, please check out Autio. It's an app that gives you amazing stories told by some of the world's best storytellers, such as John Lithgow, Phil Jackson, and Kevin Costner, and it's uniquely curated based on your location. It's a perfect audio travel companion for any road trip or just learning more about a trip you want to take. Click on the link in our show notes for more information.
Our planet is covered in water. While much of it is in liquid form, quite a bit of that water comes in the form of ice. Earth's polar regions are covered in massive blocks of ice, known as glaciers. And the tops of many of the tallest mountains on Earth have glaciers too. But that is changing fast.
This is a grand experiment that we don't know what the outcome is, but we know from history it's never been good. Our planet will adapt, right? It's shown throughout history. But what about us? What about humanity? What about the ecosystems? We're losing our refrigerator, if you will, because that's what keeps the entire planet cool and regulated and our climate nice and stable. And so we really risk even more extreme weather events as a result of losing glaciers.
This is Wild World. I'm Scott Solomon. In this episode, we're traveling high up into the Andes Mountains to see how glaciers are faring in a rapidly changing world, and to understand why it matters. The Andes are the longest mountain chain in the world, and the second highest mountain range in the world after the Himalayas. If you look at a map of South America, the Andes appear to form a spine that runs along the full length of the western side of the continent. The Andes are also very tall. There are over 100 peaks in the Andes with summits that exceed 6,000 meters, or 19,685 feet. And many of the mountains are covered in glaciers. Around the world, glaciers cover 10% of the land area on Earth. They store about 2/3 of the world's fresh water, an incredibly important and valuable resource. But as global temperatures rise, those glaciers are disappearing. Not only are we losing precious fresh water as glaciers melt into water that flows into the sea and gets salty and harder to use, but all that water is also causing sea levels to rise. In fact, if all of the glaciers on Earth melted, the sea level would rise about 230 feet, flooding every major city on the planet located along the coast. That would displace about 1/3 of the world's population. To raise awareness of this problem, the United Nations declared 2025 as the International Year of Glaciers Preservation. The first ever World Day for Glaciers was celebrated on March 21st, 2025. One person who's working to help understand and raise awareness of the problem of shrinking glaciers is Ulyana Horodyskyj Peña. She's a glaciologist, a type of geologist that specializes in studying glaciers. She has a bachelor's degree in earth science from Rice University, a master's from Brown University, and a PhD from the University of Colorado Boulder. Along the way, she was also a Fulbright Fellow in Nepal, where she lived for 10 months. Her current job is Communications Lead at North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center at the University of Colorado, one of 9 climate adaptation science centers across the country. Along with her husband, mountaineer and musician Ricardo Peña, Ulyana has set out to climb the 100 highest peaks in Colorado, the highest point in each of the 50 U.S. states, and the highest peak on all 7 continents. Along the way, they record live musical performances and make videos about the scientific research they're doing. I sat down with Ulyana when she came to Rice to speak with my public science communication class. She and Ricardo had just recently returned from another expedition to the Andes. Ulyana, thank you so much for joining us and for being on the podcast.
Happy to be here. Thanks for the invite.
So we're here at Rice, and so this is where you were an undergraduate student. You got your bachelor's degree here. I thought we would just start off by taking us back to that time. So if you think back to your time at Rice, what were you studying? What were your interests at that time?
Yeah, so when I first started at Rice, I was actually going towards an astrophysics major. And then I took a bunch of those classes. I enjoyed them, but they got really hard. And I, at the same time, had the opportunity to take an earth science class in Antarctic geology. And then I found out, there's a professor here who goes to Antarctica. I would love to have that field opportunity. So that kind of planted a seed. And then I eventually transitioned over to the earth science department to major in earth sciences. And just a couple of months before I graduated from Rice, I got a chance to go on an icebreaker down to the Antarctic Peninsula.
Wow.
And yeah, I feel like that's what really kind of caused that switch into like, I really want to be out in the field in these extreme environments. It kind of made me come alive.
Yeah. No, I understand that as a kid, you kind of had an interest in the outdoors and maybe even got to spend a little bit of time in the mountains and some snow. You talked in your TED Talk about a snowball fight as a formative experience. When was that? What was happening?
Yeah, so that was quite early. That was at age 6 for me. So I have 2 older brothers. So they were 8 and 10. And my parents had brought us to Europe for like about a month to see all the different countries and experiences. But the one that really stood out for me was the Swiss Alps. I remember we took this cog railway, this little train up to about, I think, 10,000 feet. And this is July, and there's snow everywhere. So, of course, us being kids, we're going to start with a snowball fight. And I actually saw the footage recently because my parents tracked down, the footage from that.
Old family videos.
Yeah, family videos now digitized. And I saw in the footage, me throwing a piece of snow at my mom, and my mom go and then all of a sudden you hear this rumble in the distance, and then it's an avalanche that had come down. And so it's just interesting to watch myself as a child, seeing all that happening, and then even in that video, I'm kind of taking a pause and looking, right? And so I feel like the power of nature was very imprinting from a young age. And then, I always had this interest. And at Rice, I got the opportunity in the geology department to do, camping trips, field geology trips. I got to see the KT boundary, for example, like in the rock record, that's what killed the dinosaurs. That's, for me, brought it all alive also. Yeah, I really, from a young age, loved it. And then Rice kind of continued to provide those opportunities.
Right. That's really cool. And then you, as a master's student, you were at Brown University, which is in Rhode Island, right? Mm-hmm. And that was when you started rock climbing. But Rhode Island is not a place that's known for, climbing and certainly not for mountains. So how did that start?
Yeah, well, I actually got my first taste of climbing here in Houston at one of those climbing gyms, the plastic holds. My last year, a friend introduced me and I tried it. I'm like, this is really hard. Of course, I didn't know what the rating system was, and what I was trying was super hard. But I kind of had an interest. I'm like, that's cool. And so then when I got to Rhode Island, I realized there was a club that I could join, just a local kind of climbing club. And I'm like, this might be interesting. I started to really get interested in mountaineering. And so there's the Adirondacks there, the Gunks, just all these places where you can learn technical rock climbing, as well as do some mountains in the Appalachians. And just, to kind of get a start. And I think, and that's also when I met David Brashears, who became a mentor for me, because he made that 1996 Everest IMAX film. And so he kind of took me under his wing on the side of photography, because he was doing this glacier match photography project that was looking at all the changes in the Himalaya, just visually. And that's when I started to think, maybe that's something I could do for a PhD, because the program I was in at Brown was a master's. It was actually a PhD program, but then I decided to leave with the master's and change direction and do Glaciers, because I could kind of blend my interest in mountaineering and science. So that's how that kind of all transitioned. But I still decided to finish a master's at Brown. That was really kind of different in the sense that I was doing Iceland as an analog for early Mars field work, which I love, everything space and planetary geology related. And that kind of, again, got planted here at Rice. I knew I wanted to do eventually something in planetary geology. But then I realized I need to go west for the big mountains. In Colorado, they have all the 14ers, all the peaks above 14,000 feet, opportunity to train out there, and then eventually, hopefully, head to the Himalaya.
So do you remember some of your first trips in big mountains?
Yeah, so I guess the first big one was Kilimanjaro, and that was back in 2009, and that was me just asking a friend, hey, do you want to go? And we hired, a local guiding group and went up there, and I remember how hard it was because of the altitude.
Yeah.
And
it's about 19,000 feet or so, right?
19,300, and so the training that I did, because I was living in Rhode Island at the time, was like there was no real altitude. And so I remember the library being like, I think 15 story, or I can't remember exactly how many, but I remember going into the staircase up and down, up and down, up and down with my backpack. And I would load it up with the climbing rope just for weight. And people would be looking at me like, what? Going into the stairwell.
Are you going to scale the building? Yeah, right.
But that's, just creative ways of getting training, even when you're at sea level.
Yeah. And then, we're going to talk about glaciers in a minute, but Kilimanjaro, of course, famous for the snows of Kilimanjaro, the ice cap, which, of course, is rapidly receding. And I'm sure you saw that up at the top. What was that experience like?
Yeah, that was very interesting because I already had some interest and knowledge about it back in 2009 and taking, images and seeing what the condition was of the glacier. But when I was able to return in 2017 with my own group through Science in the Wild, this participatory science group I started, looking at the pictures in 2017 compared to 2009, I was stunned at how much melt and there was of those glaciers. Like at least one of them was just half gone. So, wow, that was incredible. So first of all, it's incredible because you're already up so high and you're near the equator, right? You're like, there's glaciers up here. And then in 2017, I was actually able to get really close, and literally touch the ice and just have a look at it close up. And it was quite interesting just, again, to have that experience of visibly seeing it, touching it, and creating that experience for people too.
So let's talk a little bit about glaciers themselves. So some people think of glaciers as the things that they see near the ocean or at the edge of the ocean, but there are also glaciers up on the tops of mountains like Kilimanjaro and others. So if you're up in the mountains and you're looking at some snow and ice, how can you tell if it's actually a glacier? What is a glacier? Yeah,
I like to describe the mountain glaciers as rivers of ice. Right? It's just really slowly moving ice coming downhill because of gravity. And so there's a lot of visible features you could look for. The main ones are cracks in the ice, and those are called crevasses. I don't have one with me, but a Mars bar or a Snickers bar or Milky Way. Now I'm getting hungry. If you take that candy bar and you break it, the top part where the chocolate is kind of breaks into these cracks, and the lower part where the caramel is flows. So you can think of a glacier similarly. So there's a point at which it's cracking at the top, but there's a limit to where that crack stops, and then below that is that flow. And so it's kind of indicative of what the topography is below. So if you see a whole bunch of cracks and all this ice jumbling, you're like, oh, that's probably steep under there. And so you have to kind of also backtrack in your mind what it looked like 20,000 years ago when we were at that maximum. And so, I like to point that out in the field where you can just be walking along and then looking for these features out on the ice. In the Andes, there's a lot, and in the Himalaya, there's a lot of debris cover, rock and dirt covering the ice. So it's not always as obvious. So you kind of have to look for other features like maybe ice walls, maybe darker stuff that's showing up. Maybe there's pools of water. So we have sometimes this vision of what a glacier is as this clean blue ice with these cracks, but there's also these debris-covered glaciers that are also rapidly changing.
Yeah, and so you're saying, you think of it as a river of ice, and so that implies that it is moving like a river, and they do, right?
Yeah, just very, very slowly.
Very slowly. And so, even we have this expression like a glacial pace, like to describe something that is extremely slow. Mm-hmm. And I assume that comes from the pace of glaciers that are sort of flowing down from gravity, but they're also often receding because of climate change and other factors, right? So what determines whether a glacier is advancing or receding?
Yeah, so for advancing, you really want to get a lot more snow to fall in either the winter time or in the Himalaya during the monsoon season where you get a lot of the precipitation high up. So essentially, if you think about your bank account being in the green or the red, it's the same thing with the bank account of a glacier being that snow. And also there's a point where there's an equilibrium line that separates where it melts and where it gains. And unfortunately, that line keeps shifting to higher altitude, which means we're getting a lot more melting where we should be accumulating that snow. And so, yeah, the gain or receding is really driven by how much snow you get, because how does a glacier form? You have to have a lot of snow that then starts to compact, and then a lot more snow that falls on top of that keeps compacting until it eventually turns to ice. So that transition is super important, and we're just not having enough time and enough snowfall sometimes to grow those glaciers.
You're listening to Wild World. After a short break, we'll hear about some of the creative ways Ulyana collects data on shrinking glaciers. Hi, I'm Scott Solomon. You know, as a scientist and world traveler, I spend a lot of time on the road. And I wanted to share with you an app that can make that time more exciting, educational, and more interactive than your typical audiobook or podcast. Except for this one, of course. It's called Audio. That's AUTIO. And what it does is it uses GPS to follow your location, and then it gives you audio stories about the places that you're driving by. These stories are told by some of the best storytellers out there, like John Lithgow, Phil Jackson, Kevin Costner, and many others. The stories are short, usually about 3 to 5 minutes long, and they play for you as you drive. Or, if you prefer, you can plan a road trip and then find stories about those places to inspire you before you leave. And Audio's library of stories celebrate every voice and perspective. Rooted in curiosity, the storytelling embraces the diversity of cultures, people, and places that you discover along your travels, just like we do here on Wild World. Stories are updated and added every week, so no two journeys are ever the same. Now you can check out the audio app through a link on our website, wildworldshow.com, or in the podcast show notes. And by doing so, you'll also help our podcast to continue to bring you explorations of the natural wonders of the world and the voices of the people who explore, study, and protect them. This is Wild World. I'm Scott Solomon, and I'm speaking with glaciologist Ulyana Horodyskyj Peña. So we hear a lot about glaciers melting, glaciers disappearing, but this is something that you actually study. So what are some of the ways that you collect data about changes to glaciers?
A lot of it is actually photographic. So during my PhD, I set up these time-lapse cameras to watch the changes. In particular, in the Himalaya where I was studying, there's a lot of these lakes that form on the surface of the glacier. And so that water is going to be able to heat up more. And so then it can start to eat away at the ice surrounding it. And so that's one way that you can kind of eat away at a glacier. And then we also will take measurements using sonar. So actually getting an inflatable raft out there with sonar. And as a graduate student, the budget was quite small. And so we used fish finders. There were no fish, we can confirm, in these lakes.
Because fish finders are actually using sonar technology.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
Right.
And so it's just a cheap way kind of to get images of like, well, how deep are these lakes? How big are these lakes actually? What's underneath there? And so, you know, there's ways you can be really creative. We actually worked with students at a different university who built the robotics kind of for it to tow the fish finder around these lakes, because we realized there's a lot of rocks and ice coming down into the lake, so it's not safe for a person to be in there with that machinery. And then I've kind of also transitioned into really studying the pollution that's present in the snowpack. And so that requires physically climbing to the locations and collecting the samples, doing some in situ kind of information on snow temperature, the snow grains, what did they look like, what's their shape and size. All of that gets put into a numerical model that can actually tell you how much extra melting is happening due to the presence of pollution. And the interesting thing is you can't always visibly see the pollution in the snow. It's really tiny, like less than the width of a hair. And so, yeah, I've kind of been looking at both ends of the glaciers where these lakes are forming and melting more dramatically, that ice, and then in the upper parts, the healthier, if you will, that snowpack, how that's being also melted by pollution.
And so When you talk about pollution, I know one of the things that you study is black carbon. Can you talk about what black carbon is and where it comes from?
Yeah, so black carbon, it comes from something called incomplete combustion. So when you have a fuel source that burns in the presence of oxygen, you obviously get your heat and energy from that. But there's byproducts. Byproducts are greenhouse gases. But when you have partial burning of that fuel source, because, say, lack of oxygen, it also creates this extra carbon or soot or black carbon. So there's these tiny particles that kind of get lofted up into the air. They're 2.5 microns or less, so they fall under that PM 2.5, that particulate matter 2.5 category. You might hear that sometimes in the news about that being bad for air quality.
Yeah, and that's something you want to breathe in.
Right. So human health gets impacted by this black carbon, and so does planetary health, because these particles can get lofted and get transported globally just in a matter of weeks. And oftentimes it will settle out in places like the Arctic or Antarctic, and where it falls on that snow and ice and causes that accelerated melting. Because these particles are dark, they absorb more solar radiation.
So it's kind of like if you wear, black clothes on a hot day, you feel hotter because that black color is absorbing more heat, right?
Exactly. And I'm kind of regretting my choice wearing all black in Houston.
Yeah, you are wearing all black today. Luckily, it's not too hot yet today, but yes, that's true. So even though these particles are so incredibly tiny, they can actually still have an impact on the melting of something as enormous as a glacier?
Absolutely, because the way it works is they're really small, but they kind of pack a big punch. So again, they absorb that solar radiation, the snow starts to melt, and then what happens is black carbon is hydrophobic. It doesn't really like the water, so it's not going to run off as that snow melts. It's going to just kind of keep accumulating and clumping together. And so then you start to visibly see these particles. We could visibly see it in Greenland, for example, just masses of this stuff all over the surface. And so then you have, again, a more positive feedback loop. You have more ability to absorb solar radiation, more melting, and then eventually that black carbon is a layer on top of the ice. And so the ice is not as reflective as the snow. So again, you have this kind of accelerated melting happening, and you can visibly actually see this. Maybe not at the start, but with time, you'll be able to see it.
So you said that this black carbon comes from incomplete combustion, so things that aren't burning up all the way, I guess, right? So is that a new issue? Or it sounds like the kind of thing that maybe has been going on for a while.
Yeah, it's been going on for a while, and it's almost like a 50-50 split of where it comes from, where 50% is coming from us, like residential, industry, power plants, all that kind of stuff, cars, factories, and then the other half is from biomass burning. And so that one is a little more challenging to deal with. I mean, you can try to minimize the open burning of agriculture that happens in places like Africa and Asia, but then also you have wildfires, right? So wildfires is something that's an indirect result of climate change, especially in Colorado, it's just drought is drying up the trees, and they're just basically like tinder waiting to go up. So that's definitely more challenging as far as like the soot is also coming from wildfires. But at least maybe we can do something about the half that we're responsible for.
Yeah. So what kinds of things can people do in order to kind of reduce how much of this black carbon is ending up on glaciers?
Yeah, so a lot of the emissions will come from cars. And so going electric or even hybrid is better if you can't go fully electric. And that's something that people can be doing. And also just there's filters that can be put, for example, on cars, factory regulation, really. So this has to come out from a policy standpoint, which is why I'm so interested in collecting the data from all over and showing, here are the hot spots of where this pollution is collecting. And it's maybe coming from these sources based on wind patterns. And it could be that source. That could be that factory, for example, that coal-fired power plant. And it should be doing better at scrubbing that black carbon out of the atmosphere, but it's not, right? And so there are solutions. The black carbon part of the climate crisis is solvable and scalable, but we need data. Like, where is that actually coming from?
Right. And so in the data that you've helped collect or that you've been involved in analyzing, does it look like people who are living far away from glaciers are still having an impact through their emissions? Does it, if you don't live anywhere near a glacier, should you still be thinking about the impact that you're having on glaciers? Absolutely.
Yeah, that's the thing, that black carbon is really far reaching. Something that happens here in Houston or in Colorado, doesn't stay here, right? And so it can actually, because of the wind directions, end up in Greenland. And so, yeah, anything people can do here will absolutely help. So, there's the personal part of this, which is like maybe reducing how much we drive, or taking public transportation. But then there's corporation accountability. That's a big one. And so, again, to inform that, we need the data showing, hey, it is you guys, or it is coming at least from this region and making its way up here. And why do we care about the Arctic or Antarctic? People are so far removed, especially in Houston, like so far removed from it. Well, it's like what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic also, right? So if you have melting ice up there, that actually affects global weather patterns. It will affect hurricanes, for example, which Houston gets hit by.
Yes, we do. Yeah. Now, I've also heard that microplastics have been found on some of the highest mountains in the world. How do they get there?
Microplastics is something I just have started looking into, and I have colleagues who have really been just looking into like exactly what we're saying. How does it actually end up in the mountains? And at least in the Rockies, they have these containers that measure precipitation. And at one point, one of the rangers went to look into one of these and saw like all this stuff collecting. It's like, what is this? And an analysis was done, and it was plastic was raining out of the sky.
That's crazy.
And so it's kind of a similar idea of like these things when they're so small, micro or nanos, that they can get lofted also into the air. And we are a plastic nation. We're a plastic world. Plastic is convenient for so many things, but it's being found everywhere. I had a colleague who just came back from a Greenland trip literally just a week ago, and she was finding it in the soils up in the Arctic as well. And it's also found in human bodies. And again, that is something that is solvable and scalable, but we need to know like how far reaching is it? And I'm still waiting back on some of the analysis of samples I collected both in the Antarctic and Arctic on it. So I'm very curious to see, like, these are really remote places, like remote corner of Greenland, West Antarctica and the Ross Sea area, where hardly anyone goes. So yeah, it's becoming a more pervasive, persistent problem. But again, the thing is we can do something about it, but we need the data and then act on that.
Absolutely. And you say these plastics are ending up in our bodies, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, do we know much about the health effects? It can't be good.
It can't be good. So I can't speak much to that. Just from what I've read, that it seems like we each consume the equivalent of like the size of a credit card worth of plastic, which is really alarming.
Yeah, that is a lot.
And there was some research. I just remember reading about how they're detecting microplastics in the bloodstream in arteries of people who've had heart attacks. There's no like exact correlation yet, but it's just interesting that like when they did the autopsies, they're finding micro and nanoplastics in the arteries. So.
Wow, that is crazy. Now, you and your husband do a lot of mountain climbing all over the world. Are melting glaciers making that more dangerous?
Yeah. I mean, so my husband's been climbing a lot longer than me, so he's had this amazing record of photos and just the experiences of being on these peaks. But to give you an example, we climbed and got engaged on Mont Blanc in the French Alps. And just climbing up it one way and down another, I mean, you could just see the impact of the melt. Like just a lot more rock fall. So you can almost think of like those mountain glaciers as being the glue, right? And they're holding the mountain together, if you will, to an extent. And as the glacier melts and as any kind of ice that got embedded with those rocks melts out, it's going to mobilize a lot more of those rocks. So you definitely have to be a lot more cognizant of that. And we obviously climb with helmets, but if you have a massive boulder coming down, that doesn't help. So we have to start climbs pretty early. They're called alpine starts, which have been like, hey, we'll start climbing at 3 or 4 in the morning before everything starts melting. On Mont Blanc, we start climbing at like 11 p.m. so that we avoid the heat of the sun mobilizing the ice and the rock. And the year we were climbing it was also like a record heat wave in Europe.
Which are becoming more common, of course. Yes. And so that must be, in addition to having to hike at night, basically, you must also have a narrower kind of, window of when in the year you can even do that safely. Great
point. Absolutely. Yes. So that window is narrowing. And because the window is narrowing, more people are going to be on the mountain, and people can also dislodge rocks and ice. So you have kind of a compounding problem here.
Now, I know that you've spent a lot of time in the Andes, and the Andes, this is the longest mountain chain in the world. It's the second highest mountain range in the world after the Himalayas. And you've climbed the highest peak in the Andes, Aconcagua. What was that experience like?
Yeah, Aconcagua is almost 23,000 feet, so it's the highest I've been to. And I remember the feeling is very surreal. Like the impacts of having less oxygen up there is just, it kind of feels like slow motion. Like your mind is willing to, like, it wants to go faster, but your body is just not catching up. And at the same time, we were doing science on the peak, so I had to have like really good notes about like, all right, follow these steps exactly, because it's going to be really hard with that lack of oxygen. And the muscles, are really straining because, you need, the body kind of focuses on protecting the core, right? And so, yeah, it's a strange feeling. So that's why you have to acclimatize, which means you kind of progressively go up to higher camps that you set, and then you don't obviously climb it all in one go.
No, it's not a day hike.
Nope, definitely not a day hike. It'll take sometimes 2 to 3 weeks to climb. Wow. And the high camp that we did was at the height of Kilimanjaro, and you still have to go higher. Wow. Right? So that was an interesting night because you don't really sleep that well. You kind of just rest and then you go for it, but you also go for it quite early in order to maximize chances of success, because storms can come up in the afternoons. And then, of course, you also have the melting glacier impact.
Well, tell me a little bit more about the melting glacier. So Aconcagua, as it says, the highest peak in the Andes. How much glacier is there on Aconcagua? Are you on a glacier the entire time?
No, so there's multiple routes that you can take, and because we saw the status of the glacier on the other side, decided actually not to go for that side. So the normal route now doesn't have anything really glaciated you have to go over. It's actually in some ways harder because it's so rocky. You almost prefer to have snow and ice because it's just a lot easier on the body, but at the same time, because of the height and the steepness, you have an added danger of sometimes you're just climbing on pure ice. All right, so sometimes you want to have that nice snowpack over ice. My husband and I we're trying to do Mexico's highest peak called Orizaba, which is the third highest in North America. It was like a sheet of ice because all the snow had melted off. So you could just imagine how hard climbing that is with your ice tools and with your crampons, the spikes on your boots. And we weren't successful. We couldn't get to the summit.
Wow.
So it's definitely changing.
And it's icy because it's like melting and refreezing, or what makes it so icy?
Yeah, so basically so it had a nice snowpack on top of the ice, but because of the warming temperatures, all that snow melted off and it just left the glacier ice below.
Oh, I see. So it's really just sort of exposed the glacier that has been there. And is that glacier also shrinking?
It's shrinking quite rapidly and extensively. Mm-hmm.
Let's take another quick break. When we come back, we'll hear a remarkable story about how glaciers helped to save the lives of 16 people whose plane crashed high up in the Andes Mountains.
To support this Wild World podcast, please check out Audio. It's an app that gives you amazing stories told by some of the world's best storytellers, such as John Lithgow, Phil Jackson, and Kevin Costner, and it's uniquely curated based on your location. It's a perfect audio travel companion for any road trip or just learning more about a trip you want to take. Click on the link in our show notes for more information.
Welcome back. My guest is glaciologist Ulyana Horodyskyj Peña. So what are some of the other peaks in the Andes that you've climbed, or glaciers in the Andes that you've had a chance to explore and study?
Yeah, so I've been up in the Cordillera Blanca, also in Peru. So that was very challenging climbing as well. And we're actually looking for pollution impacts on the glaciers up there. But perhaps a more unique climb is up to the impact point of a plane crash, the Uruguay Air Force Flight 571. I know how familiar you are with the story, but in 1972 there was a plane crash of an Uruguayan flight that was carrying a rugby team and their family and friends. They were flying to Santiago, so over the Andes, and they ended up crashing instead. And The glaciers there are really far removed from civilization. You have, in order to get there, you have to take a 4x4, you have to horseback ride, you have to hike. So you're really far removed from any kind of civilization, and yet the glacier, how it's changing, is stunning and rapid. So for me, that was very powerful visual of like, hey, even in places that are really untouched, if you will, by humans, they're still changing. How many places on the planet, how many glaciers on the planet, we have the same story unfolding, but no one's a witness to it?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very famous situation because of the incredible survival story of the 16 people that did make it out of that horrific tragedy. And from what I understand, your husband actually made a kind of a remarkable discovery there. Can you tell me what he found? Yeah,
so back in 2005, he was actually climbing Aconcagua, and then he knew of the story of the Andes survivors, and he wanted to see it for himself. So there's a memorial there across where they bury the remains of those who didn't survive. And so he hired a horse handler to go up there. And then once he got there, he was like, I want to see like where the plane actually impacted. Everyone says it's this kind of main gully here where there's some plane parts that have come down, the propeller, pieces of the wing. And so he started to go on up. And then he realized, there's another plane piece over in this gully, this other kind of side gully. And so he started climbing up that gully. And then he was getting close to what may have been the impact point, up at almost 14,600 feet. He sees something blue sticking out of the rocks. So he's like, what is this? So he starts looking through the rocks, and it's a coat. It's one of the, like a sports coat. And then inside the pocket, like the inside pockets that you have, there was a wallet, and it had some cash in it, and it had an ID, and it said Eduardo Strauch. And he knew of the Strauch cousins, and they were like really like a key part of the story. So he knew this is one of the survivors. Oh my goodness. And it came down a different gully than the other plane parts. So that kind of got him thinking about, well, what if the plane impacted at a different point here? So we started climbing all the way up there and kind of got a visual, of how it could have all happened. And so then he brought down the wallet, and the ID, but left, the coat there because he's like, well, this is history. But then he managed to get connected with the survivor by phone. And he was able to reunite him eventually. Like, it took 3 years until the coat could be retrieved because there was a bunch of snowstorms there that ended up covering it up again. And so this gives you an idea of like, even 20 years ago, the weather was quite variable. The glaciers were still, pretty healthy. But eventually the survivor got reunited with the jacket, and the whole other part of this story unfolded where they've been going to the site for 20 years. And I've had the chance to join for the last 7 years now and put a scientist kind of lens on it about, well, how is this glacier changing?
I mean, this is just, there's so many remarkable, aspects to this story. I mean, your husband, Ricardo, finding this incredible historical artifact that has an ID so he can actually know who it belonged to, and then, actually giving it to that person and forming this connection, this friendship, as I understand it. And then, I mean, the fact that they've gone back together and that you've gone as well to the site with him. I mean, can you just give us a sense for what it's like to visit this site with Eduardo, with one of the survivors of this accident?
Yeah, so I can recall my first experience quite vividly because it was just, I knew the story as a teenager, right? And then I'm like, oh my gosh, and now my husband is...
Yeah. I mean, there've been movies about this, right? Like the movie Alive, and there's been some documentary. I mean, it's a really well-known story,
Yeah, so it's like, wow. So I read about this story, and now my husband found the coat and wallet of one of the survivors. I'm meeting the survivor for the very first time back in 2018, and she was so friendly, so kind. You could ask him anything, about, what he survived. And he has a book called Out of the Silence. And he said it was inspired by Ricardo because he's like, he hadn't really talked about the accident, but when he received back his jacket, it was like being reunited with an old friend. And so then he started opening up about it and was open to the experience of letting more people hear from him about what that was like, and also at the site. And so when we went up to the memorial site where the cross is and the remains are buried, and there's a lot of the parts of the plain there, I remember I was in tears. I was so moved by it. I mean, like seeing him going up there, and remembering his friends, because his best friend also, died in that accident.
And had he been there previously?
He had been. So he had been going since 2006, but not prior to that. And then it's kind of made a commitment every year, because he said it also serves as a good reminder of his friends, what happened, and how fortunate he is in life. And I feel that's a good lesson for all of us, right? Like when I went there and I really like connected with the story and really reflected on what that must have been like, it's like, wow, we are so fortunate. There's so much gratitude to have for life. And for him, he said it's like a life affirming thing. So that was very impactful, and people can join, they can join these trips, they can have that experience. And Eduardo's 77 now, and he's still going. It's just, for me, it's just absolutely incredible, like how he continues to make that pilgrimage and share his story.
I mean, it is remarkable, and you're adding another layer to it, because you're going there as a scientist, as a glaciologist. And tell me a little bit about what your sort of science lens is on this story. How has this place changed?
Yeah, it's pretty incredible, because so Ricardo, since he's been going for like these 20 years now, has this amazing photographic record. So we've taken some of those photos, and then the book Alive, there's a photo in there that shows the glacier, how it was in January of 1973. And so you can actually see how filled the glacier is, and then compare it to photos now to see how much the glacier has shrunk. It's an interesting point, because we were talking about advancing and retreating glaciers before. And these typical debris-covered glaciers, where they have all this rock and dirt on top, they deflate or they get thinner. And so I kind of did the same thing I did for my PhD, which is bring these laser-ranging binoculars, old photographs, GPS units, and try to do matching of, okay, here's where the glacier was. Now let's do a sighting across to the other side of the glacier. As the glacier shrinks, it leaves behind almost like these bathtub rings, if you will, of like where the ice level was. And so you can measure and then match to the photo. Oh, that was 20 years ago, and that was 30 years ago. You can also use satellite imagery. And so in the span of 50 years, so I went in 2022 with these binoculars to do some more kind of higher resolution data collection. In the span of 50 years, you have a drop of like 40 meters.
Wow.
That is remarkably fast. It's very similar to what my PhD research found in the Himalaya. And so I was like, wow, this is very telling, because again, this is a glacier that's pretty far removed from any kind of obvious sources of humanity, of humanity's impact. And yet it's on a similar pace of melting and shrinking as it is globally.
And I mean, there's another aspect to it too, right? Because the amount of snow and ice that was there at the time of the crash in 1972, as I understand it, actually may have helped to, prevent some of the people from dying in the impact itself. It sort of cushioned the blow.
Absolutely.
To a certain extent, right?
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, because we were just able to go up to the impact point a couple weeks ago, and it was so bare. And it just made me think about, if the plane hit now, there'd probably be no survivors. There's no chance. It's hitting rock, and it would tumble out of control. So there was a lot more snow and ice back there, back in 1972. And also I kind of did a little bit of digging into like, well, what was going on atmospherically even at that point? And it happened to be a very strong El Nino year. So El Nino is this pattern in the Pacific of warming, and it can cause a lot of precipitation, for example, in the Andes on a particularly strong year. And so it happened to be a strong El Nino year that allowed for a lot of snow and ice. Of course, there was already a lot more glacier in general, but just a lot more. And so it cushioned, like you said, the blow and the impact. But then all that extra snow kind of became a trap also, because they couldn't easily get out. They had to wait, for a couple of months until they were able to finally, two of them were able to climb out. And so just a couple of weeks ago, having a look at where those men climbed the head wall to go out and get help was very moving also to envision them doing that. Like what effort it took when they're starving and they have no mountaineering knowledge to do that, the bravery it took also. And then looking at the head wall now of like hanging glacier, so pieces of ice coming down and rock and all this, it's like there would be no way to even safely climb out now.
just incredible. I mean, it's such an amazing human survival story, and what these people went through is unfathomable. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting, as you say, to reflect on the fact that it wouldn't even be possible today because of how much the snow and glacier has been affected by climate change. In our final segment, I'll talk with Ulyana about some of the ways that she's getting everyday people involved in her work on glaciers.
To support this Wild World podcast, please check out Audio. It's an app that gives you amazing stories told by some of the world's best storytellers, such as John Lithgow, Phil Jackson, and Kevin Costner, and it's uniquely curated based on your location. It's a perfect audio travel companion for any road trip or just learning more about a trip you want to take. Click on the link in our show notes for more information.
You're listening to Wild World. I'm speaking with Ulyana Horodyskyj Peña about her work documenting the disappearance of glaciers. So, climate change has also become a politically divisive issue, even though it's really not controversial among scientists, right? And so how do you discuss climate change in your work on glaciers with people who are skeptical?
Yeah, that's a really tough one because there are people who will, no matter what you say, just won't believe it. So we kind of try to go towards people who are on the fence about maybe they just don't have enough knowledge. And so the work that I do at the Climate Center is communication, right? So it's about really informing the public to an extent, but also resource managers. They are the ones who are going to be allocating what's happening with our resources in a time of climate change, especially drought is going to really impact the region where we work. And so we really try to come at it from the perspective of, what's going to happen to the water, what's going to happen to the crops, and even the economics of that. And so I think if you could put a lens on something that matters to them, then they're more interested in learning about it. So that's kind of how we've approached it. So really it depends on your audience, right? And what they, in some ways, maybe not want to hear, but need to hear just for the sake of their livelihoods.
Now, I know you've also been really involved in getting people to be able to engage in the process of doing science itself through, what's sometimes called participatory science, or sometimes people call it citizen science, right? So I know that you started a program called the Sherpa Scientist Initiative, I think when you were a graduate student, right? Can you tell me a little bit about that project?
Yeah, so when I was in Nepal, I was coming and going, on a few expeditions and trips and met a lot of the local people, the Sherpas, and I was like, it would be really interesting to hear, what from their perspective, what have they seen change? Right? We have the scientific lens of the measurements, the quantitative stuff, but the qualitative data, what do they see happening, down the generations? And then I actually got a Fulbright, so I got to live in Nepal for almost a year, so it was 10 months. And I'm like, this is an opportunity to really build this initiative with scientists and Sherpas working together, both from storytelling and from the scientific data collection viewpoints, to really understand what's happening, what the changes are, and informing the communities, but also the greater public. So that was something that happened during my graduate career. It didn't have funding, obviously, to continue, but then it transitioned into something called Science in the Wild, which is where I started to take people from all over the world who wanted to come on these kinds of expeditions, help out with science, talk to people in the communities, and really understand, the real world impact of this.
So, yeah, tell me a little bit more about Science in the Wild. What are the types of things that you do, and how do people who aren't scientists get involved in this?
Yeah, so it kind of started off as expeditions back in 2017. So you can come to Kilimanjaro as an educator and learn about science. You can maybe create curriculum or a lesson plan from what you learned there and bring it back to your classroom. You can help with the research I was doing on black carbon, contribute in the data collection, but also in the interpretation. What does this mean, right? Because a lot of the citizen or participatory science is about just collecting data for scientists, but I wanted it to come full circle, be what does this mean, right? Because I feel there's kind of a disconnect of data to final product. So what's that in between, right? So that was what kind of motivated Science in the Wild. The pandemic hit, we had to pivot, and so I did a lot more stuff online, virtual classes and storytelling also. And then it kind of morphed into this persistent pollutants project, which is what I'm working on now, focused on the black carbon and microplastics. So really involving the public, hopefully growing bigger in the sense that we can figure out, hey, where are our pollution hotspots here or even in other places around the world? And how can we really cause real change? Because that's the big picture. That's what I'm aiming for. I'm at the data stage now and getting people and recruiting and involving them and having them understand what that process is for actually interpreting data. But that kind of big picture still thing is, well, how do we actually enact change from all that?
So what are some ways that, if listeners are wanting to get involved, what are some things that they can do?
Yeah, I mean, if they want to join the project, it's on scienceinthewild.com, and there's a tab called the Persistent Pollutants Project, and really just emailing me about, well, what's the interest? Are you an everyday person, lay person who wants to just help out with science, or do you have a classroom that you would love to have a science kit? And so I am actively looking for any kinds of classrooms, for example, teachers who might be interested, because we have a big project coming up in September up to the North Pole. That'd be a great chance to do simultaneous sampling. While scientists are sampling near the North Pole, have students sampling, perhaps near or in their classrooms, and we're hoping to develop a lot of educational content that can be used across the nation and world. That's kind of, again, the big picture.
That's exciting. Well, that's amazing. Yeah. And what if somebody just wants to make a contribution? Like, is there a way that, donating some funds to one of these organizations would be helpful?
Yeah, I would say just contacting me. I have Ulyana at scienceinthewild.com listed on the page too, but we are really would love to have donations and help, like sponsoring a science classroom, for example, or we've applied for funding and we're still waiting to hear back on, just grants, but we've had applied for grants that were federally funded that unfortunately are not coming through. The whole kind of tagline, if you will, for Science in the Wild was science by the people for the people, right? We're democratizing science. And so whatever people want to do, whether it's donating funds or time or helping outfit classrooms and building curriculum, I want to cover the full spectrum.
So why is this kind of participatory science important to you?
I think it's really important because I think there's, again, a disconnect with what scientists actually do and where, like, a lot of our data come from. For example, like, where do our weather forecasts come from? Well, from our iPhone. Okay, no. Where's that data coming from? Is it coming from NOAA, scientists and weather balloons? So I think really bringing people into the process of, like, this is a way of thinking also. This is critical thinking that can apply to everyday life. Right? When we're thinking about even politics, for example, of like what decisions are being made, if we can critically think about these things and then we can learn these skills through say, the participatory science, that can help us all, in multiple aspects of life.
Absolutely. And just to really sort of bring it home, I mean, as we think about glaciers and, you've personally witnessed and documented some of the really rapid changes that are happening to glaciers around the world. What are we losing if we lose glaciers? What is maybe to put it another way, like, what are some of the ways that glaciers are helpful to people?
Sure. I mean, quite literally, we're losing fresh water, right? You can think of these glaciers as water storage towers. This is especially important for mountain communities. So we're losing, actual freshwater sources. And we're also losing history and stories, right? There's a lot of information you can get from ice cores. These are these tubes of ice that you can collect from the larger ice sheets, like in Greenland and Antarctica, where the layers tell the history of, like, well, what was our atmosphere doing 100,000 years ago? What can we learn from the past? Right? Because never in our history have we seen such a rise of greenhouse gases in such a short amount of time. Yes, we've seen higher amounts of, say, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but we're talking about tens of thousands of years that it took to switch, right, to rise. And we're talking about hundreds of years. This is a grand experiment that we don't know what the outcome is, but we know from history it's never been good. It's led to mass extinctions. Right? So maybe our planet will adapt, right? It's shown throughout history. But what about us? What about humanity? What about the ecosystems? And so I think we really lose an opportunity to learn from the past, and that's critical for our future. And then we're losing our refrigerator, if you will, at the polar regions, because that's what keeps the entire planet cool and regulated and our climate nice and stable. And so we really risk even more extreme weather events as a result of losing glaciers.
So as you think about the future, the next 5-10 years, what are your fears? What are your hopes? What are your personal goals?
Yeah, my fear is that we're just not going to act in time. We've known about this problem since the 80s. We're seeing almost 40 years now down the pipeline, like what this means as far as like these extreme weather events. They're not unrelated, right? Like even these huge wildfires and hurricanes, more powerful. I mean, the planet operates on energy, right? And so if we're increasing the energy, if you will, and intensity in a lot of these storms. So I fear that we're not going to do enough in time to really mitigate those impacts, maybe not to ourselves, but to future generations. My hope is that like humanity will rise to the occasion to some extent, because people with enough knowledge and say through participatory science realize, oh, what are we doing? Perhaps enough people just don't have the knowledge, for example, to know like how damaging this is. And until they physically feel it, will they do something? And then what was goals?
Your goals, yeah, your personal goals.
Yeah, personal goals is continuing to just work on science education and communication. You know, I still do the research, but I just really saw such a value in communicating it, right? Because you can do all the research in the world, but if you don't communicate the value or the importance of it to the public, nothing's going to change on the policy side, right? And so my personal goals are to continue on with the research and education and communication, but my big picture kind of like I would love to see some policy change if possible, especially in relation to black carbon. The shipping industry is like a big cause of this, but there are solutions if you just switch fuel sources, for example. And it's so, again, it's solvable, scalable, and I want to see it happen.
Well, Ulyana, thank you so much for sharing all of your amazing work that you're doing and helping people to understand, you know, what's at stake here and how they can get involved.
And thank you so much.
To follow Ulyana and Ricardo's mountain climbing expeditions, visit summitsongandscience.com. To learn more about glaciers, visit the World Glacier Monitoring Service website, wgms.ch. Check out the show notes or go to our website, wildworldshow.com, for more links about glaciers, about Ulyana, and to watch her TED Talk. Check out our YouTube channel at Wild World Podcast for complete episodes, video clips featuring our guests, and more. Wild World is produced by 3 Wire Creative. That's it for this episode. I'm Scott Solomon. Join me next time as we explore another part of our wild world.